In 2023, we have found it's not as simple as putting questions in front of a child and figuring out how much they know. It is much more multifaceted than that. The conversations about curriculum are not just about, what is actually in the textbook. It is also about who is delivering it. All of these conversations have very serious implications to who's teaching and the diversity of those who are teaching.
I'm Rick Stoddard from Mathematica, sitting in for J.B. Wogan, and welcome back to On the Evidence. On this episode, we focus on efforts to diversify the teacher workforce and provide supports to teachers from diverse backgrounds in schools. Teacher recruitment and retention challenges have increased since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. But even before that, students of diverse backgrounds historically have not seen themselves reflected in the adults in their classrooms and schools. Why does this matter? Students of color do better in school when they have teachers who share similar identities. For example, black students with at least one black teacher in grades K through 3 are 13% more likely to graduate high school and 19% more likely to enroll in college than their same race, same school peers. And all students benefit from diversity of the teacher workforce. Teachers of color are positive role models for all students in breaking down negative stereotypes and preparing students to live and work in a multiracial society. To help us better understand these issues, efforts, and challenges, our guests for this episode are Colorado State Representative Jennifer Bacon, Janet Damon, a teacher at Delta High School in Denver, Colorado, and Stephen Malik, a senior researcher at Mathematica. My colleague Kirsten Miller, a senior communications specialist here at Mathematica, leads this episode in her On the Evidence debut. We hope you enjoy this conversation.
Thank you, Representative Bacon, Janet, and Steve, for joining us for our Teacher Diversity on the Evidence podcast. So we know that teacher recruitment and retention challenges have increased as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. But even before that, for students of diverse backgrounds, we've seen a shortage of diverse teachers. So Steve, I'm going to ask you to kick us off by explaining a bit about why it's important for children to see themselves reflected in the adults in their classrooms and schools.
Thank you for having me, and it's great to meet you, Representative Bacon and Janet. And actually, I might even pivot just for a second and ask us to be specific. When we use the word diverse, are we using the term as a code word for racial and ethnic diversity? Everyone brings lines of identity that are unique, but particularly in the education system, we see that the workforce is predominantly white folk and women. Right? And so we can talk about diversity in a lot of ways. But I think in particular, racial and ethnic diversity being reflective of the student population is going to be critical. In reality, all students benefit from having teachers of all sorts of different backgrounds. We also know that students of color benefit particularly from having teachers of color. Now, the evidence isn't necessarily a randomized controlled trial comparison group design, but we have some good correlational analyses that point to students of color doing better when they have at least one teacher of color who shares that line of identity. And there's a lot of hypotheses for why this is. One is, kids see themselves in their teachers, and they see, an adult who they can admire and value as a role model. And role models play an important role in formation. There's also this idea that, if you're a teacher of color, you might operate in more culturally responsive ways, able to connect with your kids and help make the content really accessible to them. And I think importantly, I'm a former public school teacher myself. I taught in New Jersey and in New York City. And bias, whether explicit or implicit, plays out in lots of nefarious ways in the classroom. And I think it often plays out with the white adults in the classroom when they have students of color, in ways that sometimes are unexpected or even, not even aware of. Whereas, if you have a teacher of color, they are less likely to have an implicit bias that holds low expectations for the possibilities of kids. And that plays out in a lot of different ways. But I can keep going on and on. There's a lot of interesting research out there, but I'd love to hear what others have to say about that too.
Yeah, thank you so much, Steve. I think we'll turn to Janet next, and just Janet, as a teacher, as a librarian, as a literacy expert, is what Steve is describing lining up with what you've seen in the classroom and in your school?
One of the things I think about, this is my 26th year in education as a teacher, and have used and experienced a lot of different roles. And one thing I think is that students do sometimes experience some implicit bias. And sometimes, I've had students tell me that they've had teachers who necessarily didn't show them the kind of care, the kind of respect, the kind of affinity that made them feel very welcome. I've had students who have a lot of intersectional identities. So students who might be from different cultural backgrounds, different faiths, different gender identities, different sexual orientations. And sometimes, we see this sort of, space where students get to feel unseen, unheard, unvalidated, and that reduces their likelihood of wanting to stay an active participant, to show all of their self. When we are seeing students spend cognitive energy trying to make sure that they are not being targeted in the classroom, whether by students or whether by their teacher, then that's reducing the amount that they're able to use all of that cognitive power for the curriculum, the content, from radical imagining. So I think that, over the course of time, these experiences also are cumulative for students. So students who experience bias in elementary or kinder or first or second grade, how likely do they feel engaged, over the course of their instructional journey? So we have to think about the work that we're doing as being sort of cumulative and building upon the experiences. And also the work that I do as a high school, I teach at a pathway school that supports students who have experienced a number of different life experiences that can be challenging. Many of them work, many of them, have families that they help and they support. Many of them have had experiences where they might have had a family member who was incarcerated. So when we think about the healing work that a teacher can do, I also take that responsibility that I need to make up for some of the experiences you may have had with a teacher that weren't positive. So thinking about our role as interlocking and over the course of time.
Thanks so much for that, Janet. And now I'd like to turn to Representative Bacon. And Representative Bacon, as a member of the Education Committee for the Colorado General Assembly, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about whether teacher diversity is a concern in Colorado, and if there are any specific metrics that you and your colleagues are monitoring to gauge the health of teacher diversity in your state.
Thank you. That's such a great question. Also, I just want to give praises to Janet, who has saved lives with her work, and she has certainly saved mine. So I will take any platform to say that. But yes, I mean, the way that we talk about teacher diversity has been direct and indirect. I can say, even before I was in the legislature, I was part of a teacher diversity recruitment task force in a bill that was passed in 2012. And the data that we found after the study, particularly in thinking about teacher pathways, was that in the entire state in formal education programs, there were only 36 Black candidates. And, Denver Public Schools has 4,000 teachers alone, just in one district. And so I know for the last 10 years, it's certainly been of interest, particularly to legislators of color. And I will say, the last teacher diversity recruitment and investigatory bill was probably even 2 or 3 years ago, brought by a member of the Black Caucus. And so we believe teacher diversity is important for the things that we heard from our two colleagues here just a moment ago, but also it's a key part of the system. If we go all the way back to Brown v. Board and those suite of cases, if you recall, there was the doll study, right? Where do kids see themselves reflected based off of what we're teaching? The conversations about curriculum are not just about, what is actually in the textbook. It is also about who is delivering it and what kind of context they could provide. The conversations around assessment and the cultural responsiveness of the questions, let alone the outcomes and quote unquote academic gaps. All of these conversations have very serious implications to who's teaching and the diversity of those who are teaching. So directly, we will look at the teacher pool, and indirectly, we look at these outcomes and really try to find root causes, especially because we continue to create systems to quote unquote assess children, right? And I think in 2023, we have found it's not as simple as putting questions in front of a child and figuring out how much they know. It is much more multifaceted than that. And so every time we have conversations, we talk about who's teaching, whether it is funding math after school tutoring programs, to the assessment, to literally licensure. There are people who, such as myself, who regularly ask about those questions because it plays such an integral role. Who's in front of kids plays such an integral role in the outcomes that we all are talking about.
Thank you so much, Representative Bacon. And we have one of those teachers with us today. We have one of those teachers who's in front of kids. So I wonder, Janet, if I could ask you to share your story about how you became a teacher, how you entered the education field.
Well, I'll share that, I'm very blessed to have a father who, when you talk about families and parents as the first teacher, that really was my first teacher. My dad, every summer, would give me space to research things that I was interested in. He would take me to the library. I would do these reports over the summer. And then at the end of summer, he'd have like a special time, like a dinner, that he would ask me everything I learned. He'd ask me questions about it. He was just excited for me to explore the world. And so my dad is a very curious person. The other person who really made an impact on me was my second grade teacher, Miss Graham. And she just adored me. I was in Louisiana, I was in New Orleans and at a parish school. And my mother used to crochet for me little dresses, and I was wearing like a yellow one. And she said, "You have on this beautiful handmade dress. Oh, this is so important. You don't have to sit on the carpet today. You get to sit in a chair." She used to love to hear me read out loud. And so I just won't ever forget how much she loved me. And it was really important to me because the next year, when I went to third grade, I came to a very small neighborhood here in Denver, Colorado. It was kind of in a rural part of the state. My dad hadn't really gotten his bearings yet. And when I went there, I had a totally different experience. I had a teacher who really, I have my students who are transitioning to lunch as well. So you guys can go ahead and go. And that teacher, I was the only African-American girl in the school. And when I was in her class, she wouldn't take me to specials. She would leave me in the classroom alone with coloring sheets and handouts. And almost I felt so excluded, so marginalized. And I hold up both of those teachers as being the reason why I became a teacher. One was to make sure that students felt loved, seen, heard, supported. And the other was to make sure students didn't feel marginalized and excluded. Yeah.
So, Janet, I'm sorry. I know your students are transitioning, but I do have a follow-up question for you. Were there challenges, and if so, what challenges did you face when you were looking for a teaching position, and in your preparation as well?
Well, I ran into barriers around teacher preparation. So I knew I wanted to be a teacher. I loved my students, and I ended up going to MSU to become a teacher. And when it came time for the student teaching portion, I really felt I could not go that duration of time without having an income. So I took up my second love, and I also love books and love reading. And so I became a librarian. And so with me, I was very fortunate that at the time there were some shortages of people to work in high schools, to be able to teach research and to teach. And so they offered me a program where I was able to get an emergency authorization. I was able to go into the classroom and complete my student teaching portion while taking courses and while working in a school. So that kind of innovative programming made a space for me. And that allowed me, can you shut my door too, baby? That allowed me to be able to not only not only become an educator, but allowed me to also be able to support my family, help my family. I had a non-traditional pathway, but it also gave students access to someone who had, I have an advanced degree beyond my master's. I have my master's degree. I have lived experience that matches my students. I come from a family. My mother is an immigrant. My mother is from Korea. My father, grew up during Jim Crow segregation. So all of those experiences inform what I bring to the classroom, especially with multilingual learners, with students who have encountered barriers regarding, income disproportionality. And so all of that lends itself to what I bring to the classroom.
When Janet talks about the challenges of getting in, the barriers of entering the workforce, the teacher workforce, are really pronounced. And I think this is one of the big issues that the education space really needs to grapple with. I think rightly so, there has been a big push toward making sure that teachers have the content expertise and preparation needed to be teachers. Our kids deserve the best, period. No, non-negotiable, right? Like all of our kids deserve the best. But we've sometimes, hung our hat on barriers to entry that really don't, or on sorts of things that really don't get very far. Licensure exams don't necessarily predict teacher quality, right? So if we're saying everyone has to pass this test at a certain, score, that might not actually have anything to do eventually with the quality of teaching that happens in that teacher's classroom. And then, Janet, you also talked about just the expenses, right? Like, that's super tough, right? That's true of a lot of folks. If you go into just about any school and you interact with some of the paraprofessionals that work in that building, many of them will say, yeah, I really wanted to be a teacher, but for one reason or another, getting that 4-year degree or getting that teacher certification because of cost just wasn't feasible for me. And so you see a lot of school districts that are kind of being innovative with paraprofessional pipelines, but every single paraprofessional has like kind of their own stuff they got to work through in terms of like credits and other sorts of requirements. So I think it really invites policymakers to think about what are really the things that we have to hold as non-negotiable, that we really think are linked to teachers doing right by kids, particularly kids who have been historically, and I would argue purposely, underserved by the education system, and setting up systems around that. Representative Bacon, you mentioned the number of candidates of color, I believe, in the pipeline in Colorado, and that's true nationwide. And I'm a little fuzzy on the exact number right now, but they did a study of in Pennsylvania of the number of Black men in the pipeline to become teachers, and it was maybe in double digits. It might have been around 100. The entire state of Pennsylvania, one of the most diverse states in the country, right? Like, what? Huh? What? That doesn't make sense, right? And so, I think it also underlies there's this structural issue that many educator prep programs face, which is it's a model of if you build it, they will come. If I have this fancy program that's geared towards Black men, or, we're trying to get more queer educators in the door, or whoever, right? If we just build it, magically the candidates will apply. And like our institutes of higher education reflect this. They have a separate admissions office. They have a separate Department of Education, all that stuff, right? Well, that's not how it works. Like, I don't need a fancy study to tell me that if I'm not talking to folks of color about becoming teachers, they aren't going to show up at the door coming knocking. Like, we need to actually, like, we as a system, as a society, need to be re-incentivizing the profession of education and talking to prospective candidates, particularly prospective candidates of color, to get them in the door, understand their unique needs and challenges, because racism as a system has put people in situations that makes it trickier to get where they want to go, right? And figure out ways to remove those obstacles. But let me stop rambling because, Janet, I think I see you wanted to react.
I was just affirming. There was a lot of just great nuggets that you shared there. So that's all I would say.
So I would love to hear from Representative Bacon on this around those policy implications and around anything that Colorado may be doing, for example, around a teacher apprenticeship program or around the teacher pipeline issues or, around what Janet had mentioned, where so many student teachers don't have the luxury of having what is essentially an unpaid internship. So I'm wondering if you can speak to that, Representative Bacon.
I think that before being the legislature, I was on the Denver Public School Board, and before that, I actually worked for Teach for America. So I've got a few thoughts on a lot of some of these things, especially over the last 10 years. I will say that, and this may sound kind of cynical, the Education Committee is factually filled with educators. I've taught, I think the chair of the Education Committee was a teacher, 4 other teachers at least on the Democratic side. And so the topic is always of interest. I think our challenge has been making policies that are sustainable and coherent. So as I mentioned in my first remarks, I would say in the last 10 years, every 3 years, there has been a teacher of color recruitment or diversity investigation type of bill. And as much as that demonstrates there's an interest, it also demonstrates that we have not done something sustainable, that therefore we need to bring another bill. I think something that's always at top of mind, particularly here in Colorado, is just quite honestly the funding of public education. It is some of the worst funding formulas in the country we have here in Colorado, particularly given our cost of living and what quite everyone else can see with their eyes in regards to how much things cost, what kind of future they want, and whatnot. And then when we talk about teacher pay, and then quite honestly, teacher pay for kids of color who also borrow at the highest rates in America, right? These are the types of things that we have to talk about beyond just saying, hey, we need more teachers of color, And again, so just to reiterate, we do have apprenticeship programs. We have them at district levels. The state has typically funded grants or pilots. We have made legislatively the pathways for someone to qualify as an apprentice, you know what I'm saying, and work study to become a teacher. But the funding isn't consistent, right? Or we haven't seen statewide or state prioritized led initiatives. There's certainly been like Teach Plus, all of these types of things that go out there, but it hasn't become a statewide priority. And you can always tell what's a priority by what the state funds, right? Our budgets are moral documents, if you will. So I think also what we see right now, I'm spending a lot of time because districts are trying to figure it out for themselves. We're seeing a huge proliferation of CTE programming, right? Career and technical education programming, which licensure is actually different and hands-on is actually different. We're seeing school districts share teachers in the rural parts of the state. We're seeing the metro districts doing, Denver Public Schools has its own teacher apprenticeship program and pipeline that they support and fund within, our district. Aurora Public Schools will do that too. But school districts are being left to kind of figure out the most of this, because even though we may have an apprenticeship program, if it's not in the right subject matter, right? Or if they can't get to the part of the state, or if they can't actually fund it sustainably, it doesn't really matter. So again, the conversations we have at the state level have to be, we have to pull back those layers of that onion to be able to figure out what we're doing by way of root cause. But we also need to be proactive and show initiative to continue to connect those dots and to elevate it to where things are, again, sustainable.
Thanks so much for that explanation, Representative Bacon. And I want to give both Steve and Janet a chance to respond to that and see if there are anything that you'd like to share.
Well, I will say what I think, there's so much that Representative Bacon shared just in terms of the funding and the prioritization, and I think, looking at it both from a macro level, but also this micro level, something I've seen over time is also the interactions and the way that people are treated. Like every organization begins to build its own sort of stories that are told about that organization. And so, I work for a public school district that, A lot of times, educators of color feel that they're not really being retained. So part of the story is this idea of recruitment. How do we get people in the door? But I've seen recruitment work really well. I've seen people, we've had folks go out and recruit people from the South, recruit people from the East Coast, recruit people from all over, bring them and encourage them to come here to Denver, Colorado. And then one of the things that I did for many years is I helped to support an affinity group for our educators of color, for predominantly our women of color. And the stories of how they were treated once they got into these buildings. So when you tell me that a school has one or none, there's a story there. There's a lot of painful stories there. And so I have, just now, at some point, I was starting to get calls of people whose mental health was literally being impacted by the levels of macro and microaggressions. One teacher called me because the principal, she had told students not to use the N slur. And this principal left a note on her desk saying, that we don't discipline students on the words that they use, the language that they use. And an academic article, or I've had someone who called and they were feeling so much anxiety about going to work the next day because of some of the ways they were pulled out of their teaching role and told that they're going to be doing discipline for the rest of the year because they're better at it. And so this was someone who had a PhD in music and was there to teach music. And now they were like, you're the restorative justice person. And so there are times where I just tell people, what you need right now is to be whole and to be, your mental health will come first. And so now I keep a therapist on my phone dial and I route people to her who I feel are having, an immediate need. And so, I think we can think about recruitment a lot, but if we're harming people in the process of trying to get our numbers to look a certain way, then the damage we're doing is deeper and long lasting than we anticipate, I think.
I just want to echo what Janet was sharing. And having sat at a local and state level policy table, at the local level, we certainly realized our levers. The data, to her point, it's in every level of the district. I mean, don't even get me started on what it means. We have seen data that from people who are managed by women of color, right? Or evaluated by women of color, and particularly Black women, those things are often. So, I remember being at the district and saying, we need to make in our own management and accountability systems retention and looking at this data, because otherwise the culture, which is reinforced by system, right, is not going to get us there. And at the state level, it's interesting to talk about it, and the only way it kind of comes up is through accountability system or standard, right? And that is either through licensure or through assessment or even school performance. But for what it's worth, it comes up every once in a while, like maybe retention of people of color would be increased if we measured that and evaluated your school district on it. And we don't. Don't get me started. We could talk about evaluation systems and what that really means for kids and their spirit. But for the system that we have, we don't use it towards these outcomes, and yet we keep talking about it as a priority. And so I just wanted to throw that out there to echo what she's saying, because recruitment gets most of the attention, but retention does not get policy attention, other than perhaps pay, right? So just wanted to throw that out there and say thank you, Janet, for sharing.
One of the things we see play out is when people share stories of, for instance, the Black male teacher becoming the school disciplinarian or like the dean of culture, right? I've seen people who look like me dismiss that as anecdotal and, oh, that was your experience. But that's not true. Like it's found in research, right? Like toxic white dominant culture plays out in our ed prep programs, and it plays out in our schools. And it plays out in nefarious ways at times, and it plays out in subtle ways at times. And when, wonderful. We want all teachers, white teachers, Black teachers, and all teachers to build positive cultures in the classroom that center on the whole child. And to say that, oh, but because you have students of color, it's it's teacher of color's job to make sure that happens. No, it's everyone's job. It's everyone's job, right? And so culture issues do push teachers of color out of the classroom.
Okay, so I'm going to jump in and ask some questions around support. So, particularly in the conversation we've had around there seems to be this expectation that there's unpaid labor from educators of color, right? Going back to what Janet and Representative Bacon have said, and Steve, what you've expanded on a bit from the research. So, Janet, I wonder if I could hear from you on what made you feel most supported as you were starting your career as a teacher.
So, in those days, I will say, like, when I first started my first year, there were 6 or 7 African American women who worked in my building who provided me not just, support, like, oh, do you need me to get your photocopies? No, they provided me with mentoring. They were interested in the ups and downs of my life. They were so kind to me, so supportive. I think about some of the work from Dr. Michelle Foster, who did, she examined the experiences of Black teachers, and she did a qualitative kind of study and analysis about our stories. And one of the things she found is that, having 2 or 3 other people, not just being a singleton, that has stayed with me throughout my career. I have sought and thrived under the kind of leadership that also is able to retain other women of color, people of color. So, I work in a building right now that has, it's like a quarter African American educators, a quarter. I mean, this is my first time working with an Iraqi American, and having the perspective, that she brings from her lived experience, and and having, I think. So what I look for is evidence-based, even in how I select places that I work. What's the evidence that it's a place where I can thrive? And so I know that if other people have been able to, dig and make roots there, then I probably can also thrive in that environment as well. So support to me looks like community. We know that people of color put a lot of emphasis on, community building, about being in relationship with their colleagues, feeling this sense of camaraderie with them. And so I don't know if I could have that experience if I were the only African American educator in a building.
I was certainly not in the classroom for as long as probably our colleagues here on the podcast, but the thing that made me want to go into a classroom before I even kind of understood what Janet was talking about was going and being there for my community. And I find in the work that I've done around recruitment, one of the things that was really important to me in my job, probably the last actual job that I had, was actually to diversify our teacher corps, where we were kind of like one of the least diverse in the country, and we had like one Black teacher out of 200 to about 45 to 50% educators of color. And what we found is not only what will bring people to the space, even in this day and age where teaching may not be a glorified profession, there's something to be said about our communities actually understanding what education means to our liberation, whether that is consciousness, whether that is, the way that we can thrive and live in community. And it is enough of a draw. And then the experience turns into, we call it the tax. I was the dean of culture. They're always sent to our classrooms, and don't get me started on Spanish speaking teachers and all the free translating they're doing, And then what turns into the barriers are the support within building. Like, one, do you have network who can empathize, which I think is just generally an anthropological concept. But the second becomes, can we lead, right? And so we're often also, I think in maybe the last era of public education, a lot has been said about educating kids of color and Black kids and all of those things. And our bodies are typically used in the tokenizing type of way as tokens, but we're not able to actually lead. Or once you're in a leadership position, you're combating dominant culture and also trying to bring yourself in lead. And so we've started to call that in my little circle, like the glass wall. Like it's not necessarily glass ceiling. Like you can see where you need to go and you keep hitting it because we've been put in positions where we can't lead, or that we are overtaxed, right, when it comes to our capacities. And so when I think about that as compared to why people get into the profession in the first place, it is a particular type of devastation when people kind of, become aware of those barriers and when they leave the profession, because it's not just I want to do something great. I wanted to do a we show moment here, not a me thing, and to run into that hasn't helped with this profession and trying to get people into the classroom. So it's not just people talking about the pay is low. It's talking about the experience. And, it's one thing to try to convince kids to become a teacher while they're experiencing that job, so however their experience is if they're going to want to become a teacher or not. But it's another to talk to generations of folks who've had a chance to talk to each other about what it means to be a teacher, and then what it means to really set some things aside to want to stay in the profession. And I think that is something that is part of this generation's issues and concerns for Janet and our parents. As brilliant as everyone was, my mom had PhDs who taught her because they couldn't get other jobs as African Americans, but they were used to an interesting type of quality. Teachers lived on the same street as the doctor and the janitor. And so our dynamics have shifted as a matter of culture. And then the narrative of the experience is particularly now to some of the things that we're talking about. So to me, it's not just about policies for the sake of policy, is really understanding a modern conversation of what it means for this profession, because it's more than just, bank tellers are awesome. I could have been one, but you have to make conscious decisions now to be an educator. And it definitely comes from, for most people, I would say anecdotally or whatnot, but it definitely comes from within. And then if the space doesn't match, it has such a deeper impact, when people leave.
So as we think about that, I wonder if you have any further thoughts, for anyone on the call, if you have any further thoughts around where we start that work. It's such a huge task to start those conversations within, teacher preparation programs, potentially within schools. Representative Bacon, at the policy level, you're having those conversations, and this is a little bit of a wish list, I think, at this point. Like, where do we begin to try to make some more inroads in those issues that we've all discussed and raised today?
I think honestly, I think part of it is I think about this work and through an ecological model, right? Before I get ready to reap a harvest, I do not go to the land and expect a harvest to be waiting for me. I know that it's going to take time and cultivation for me to be able to prepare the soil, plant the seed, grow it, water it. And so, looking at our current state, how are we preparing our schools to be warm, welcoming spaces for educators? Because right now, at any given moment, I have taught high school for a while, and there are students I can identify for you at 12th grade, 11th grade, 10th grade, who can say, these are people we can really bring in, to our schools in 2 to 3 years, 4 years, right? So having a program where we think about teachers identifying students who really have the kind of heart, capacity, desire to maybe become an educator. And then thinking about, post-secondary, that Representative Bacon spoke to, is that, career and technical, why don't we have these pathways so that we can move some of these students right into positions? I have students who speak Arabic. I have one student here who is from Rwanda who speaks 4 languages and who writes in Arabic. Right. So at the same time, we always are decrying we don't have enough people who speak the languages of our students. We have students who speak the languages of their families. Right. So how do we prepare these translation services? How do we prepare them to maybe be educators? And then in that time, thinking about how do we rethink some of the ways that we respond to educators who are crying out for help? So one of the first places that I think about decolonizing is human resources. There's when people reach out, you can either have an experience where you are heard and there is accountability levers that come into play. There are equity coaching maybe that might come into play for a school leader or a department director. There are people who can mediate the conversations. But, when I've had folks who have told me I cried out and the response was, you shouldn't have said anything. now you are in trouble because of the way that you used a phrase, or now, like the levers are really triggered to protect the kind of bias and harassment and so forth that people are facing. They're not necessarily geared to help. So I think when you think about what teachers are experiencing, where is the equity accountability procedures built into that first level of our structure around protecting individuals and honoring their humanity? And then identifying, do I have systemic complaints coming from this school, this system? Are they coming from the parents and families? Are they coming from the teachers? Are they also coming from the students? And doing some deep listening, right? Because the restorative work that needs to be required to bring about this kind of healing is not one and done. I met with you 2 times, the day is over. It actually would require some intentionality, and just the same way that, ecologically, anything that we plant would require us to do the kind of diligence to come back and check on it, to make sure the systems for watering, growth, all of those things are happening. So I do think that identifying and recognizing that we value students who are already demonstrating the characteristics that would make them great teachers, and incentivizing them to say, we have opportunities within our schools that we can pay for para support, and that, or pathways into fields in education. And then at the same time, thinking about what can we do to some of the real strongholds and real gatekeepers for these institutions. And I think that HR is a big one for most organizations.
I've been thinking about 2 things lately, especially because they are political. And so I'm a politician. I can probably be a little bit more political here. And everybody knows where I affiliate. So, I will say this. The first thing that is so important about this, and we've talked a little bit about it, is that if a college degree is required to become a teacher, we first need to get kids to and through college. And as much as we want to talk about, how many people are in teacher prep programs, we need to pay attention to K-12 to be sure our graduation rates are great, right? That our kids of color are graduating at proportionally, if not disproportionately high rates, just so that they can enter that profession. Part of the reason we only saw 36 is because the data also commiserate, the data is also the same, that, African Americans aren't going to college or completing college at the same rates as their white peers, right? And so we need to keep our eye on that ball and be sure that those conversations are connected. And quite honestly, it comes up for any workforce. Workforce politically is a hot button topic right now, but we haven't made connections, I think, particularly in talking about people of color in the workforce. Right now, it's very number and data driven. So for example, in Colorado, we did a whole workforce study. We know 60% of people are needing to have a tier 1 degree or a credential, right, to make a living wage. And somehow I see us paying for people to go to electrician school, and us paying for people to work in construction and health, but we're not doing the same. Interestingly, I'm paying people to go to college or to get a credential, or those who are para, right, to become teachers. And so it's interesting how workforce in and of itself has become political. And even within that conversation, political as for who. And so as a side note, the things that legislators of color, and I can speak for my caucuses, right, are keeping an eye on is we cannot recreate a system till now we're tracking kids of color, to go into certain professions. We're talking to a lot of kids of color about becoming CNAs, which is perfectly wonderful, but we're not having the conversations about them becoming physicians, right? And so the last thing I would say on workforce too is that if it is something that we need to care about as a matter of state and policy to sustain our communities because people are earning, there are a lot of people wasting a lot of political capital on things that aren't important, right? And so the most part of politics is about, as much as I would love it to be that the 100 of us as legislators are Rhodes Scholars and all have MPAs and MPPs and PhDs, we are still just people, and you've got to get people to care. And the problem with racism, whether it's explicit or implicit, is that people are either not exposed, or they don't care expressly, or they live in a world of stereotype, and they are latching onto things that they find more important because they don't connect the outcomes. So, for example, I find it odd to be in states with governors and legislators who are talking about workforce, and then simultaneously use most of their political capital to ban curriculum, right? Because for what it's worth, nobody else in the world kind of cares about that right now. Everyone has kind of caught up to where the U.S. is on manufacturing, on education, on sending kids to college. And we're using a lot of capital on talking about the quote unquote upsides of slavery, and then simultaneously saying, and realizing we're not graduating kids with other degree or credential to get them into workforce. And the question is, why is one more of a priority than the other? And what does that mean by way of political identity? You know what I mean? And so all this goes to say is, for those of us who know that these things are important, we cannot necessarily just rest on our laurels and think it's going to happen. We have to be as active and engaged in talking about why these issues manifest in ways that deeply impact our communities, and what our responsibility is to help build healthy communities, you know, and like bring that back full circle. So that matters what we're teaching kids of color. I am very black. I had 2 black teachers, one my kindergarten and my senior year, you know, and my parents were the in-between. But not having those, and then them helping me build my ties to connect to community and wanting to be of service to community, and sitting at dinner tables with parents who had to sit in the back of a bus, you know, some of these things we have not been able to talk about as of late because other people want to be more grandiose in their noise. But we have not put our narratives back on the table to say these are actual community drivers, you know? And so I think this topic is certainly about the policy tools and the levers. You know, if we are building system to these outcomes, then it should actually look like that. We should actually measure if we are recruiting and retaining people. But we also need to do our work to help people understand how important public education is and educators are to the fabric of our communities. And if we have 5 minutes, let's put our time into that, you know? And so I want everybody who can like understand what happens in Capitol buildings and maybe these school board buildings, we need to be reminded of that. These are the ways we hope you show up, right? There are certain people who are definitely organized around being opposition, but in regards to the things we love, we also need people to show up and remind the legislators of that. We need people to say it matters if there's a teacher of color in this room. We need people to say spending 3 months on this curriculum when nobody is prepared for workforce is not what we need our leaders to be doing, to just burst the bubble a little bit. So I hope maybe some of you might write your legislators after to just talk about how important these things actually are to our community.
Thank you so much, Representative Bacon and Janet, for a wonderful conversation, and Steve, for your insight. I want to just open it up as we near the end of our time together here for any final thoughts from any of our guests.
You know, obviously we need to look back to be able to look forward and recognize that the systems and policies and procedures that are in place are not there by accident. Someone made a decision at some point to build the things out the way that they are. And someone is making a decision, or someone's are making a decision to uphold those systems. And so, you know, it is important that we deeply scrutinize, because some of our institutions are built when, you know, we had an agrarian society, right? Like central district offices only exist because we passed, you know, federal legislation and we needed an entity that would put money from the feds into schools' hands, right? So that's why kind of district central offices exist, right? You know, white teachers can be effective, great teachers, but it means that they have to do their role in unpacking their own biases, recognizing the role in which racism is a systemic issue, and advocating that both within education systems and outside of the education systems to dismantle those racist systems. Because if if your students of color aren't getting degrees because the system is fundamentally inequitable, you're not going to get teachers of color, right? As Representative Bacon said. I just have to thank Representative Bacon and Janet. It's been really wonderful to meet you both and learn from you today.
Likewise, I think this has been a really rich conversation, and thank you so much for moderating this for us. And I have such great hope. And I tell my students, some of what I think surprises me sometimes is how so much our students see this overwhelming challenges that we put forth on every media platform of how everything is really very terrible. And so some of the things I have to talk to them about is like, we are the engines for change and hope. And so we cannot lose hope on any of these fronts. And we have this beautiful Generation Alpha that's coming up behind us, the largest global generation in history. And they are open-minded. They are, and so I tell my students who, are high school now, I said, you have to pay the way. This struggle is not going to be completed by one generation, by one group, one identity. It's going to take all of us in the relay race together. Each of us carries the baton for the length and the space that we are assigned to it. And then we pass that baton. We cheer on the next generation. We continue to stay engaged. So my last thought is, be hopeful and be a part of the good work and the good trouble and the good change. And the reward is that you at night are at peace with yourself, that you've done all that you can do, and you move things for each generation to take its next leg of the journey, and as leaders and as the workers of it.
I think that is a wonderful stopping point for us today. So again, thank you so much, Janet, Representative Bacon, and Steve, for being on this podcast with us today.
Thanks again to our guests, Colorado State Representative Jennifer Bacon, Janet Damon, and Steve Malik. And thank you for listening to another episode of On the Evidence, the Mathematica podcast. If you liked this episode, please consider subscribing to catch future episodes. We're on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and other podcasting platforms. You can also learn more about the show by visiting us at mathematica.org/ontheevidence.